Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Jack Symes. He is the producer of the Panpsycast Philosophy Podcast, and he is also currently teacher and researcher of philosophy at the University of Liverpool in the UK. And he is the editor of a Bloomsbury series called Talking About Philosophy. The first book is Philosophers on Consciousness, talking about the mind, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So, Mr. Symes, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on. And by the way, I'm a fan of the podcast. So,
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me on. We've had this one planned for quite a while, haven't we? For a few months, or maybe even a couple of years now, we've been trying to organize something.
yeah, if I remember correctly, I've been trying to have you on the show at least since 2019. At least
Oh,
that's
wow.
when I started following your podcast. So.
Great. Well, thank you for your kind words about the podcast, and thank you for immediately marketing the book at the very start of the interview as well. You've had chance to read through the book?
I've read it all, and I have to tell you
Great.
that probably most of the philosophers you interviewed, it was for the podcast, but then you added parts of the interview for the book. Some of them I've already had on the show, like Susan Blackmore, Patricia Churchland, Massimo Pigliucci, and others. So, yeah, I guess we have some background in common, I would say.
Yeah, both being in public philosophy and both being interested in philosophy of mind. Like you say, I have seen some of those interviews you've done in the past with those thinkers. So hopefully there'll be lots for us to talk about today.
Of course. And by the way, since we've started talking about your podcast, tell us a little bit about it. I mean, how and why did you start this podcast? Did you have any specific goals in mind for it?
Yeah, like that's a really nice way and a good start. I think we started back in 2016. We can conceive of the idea back in 2015, so 5 or 6 years ago now. And it was myself, Andrew Horton, my co-host, and Oliver Marley, my other co-host at the time. And we were all training to teach at the University of Birmingham. Those two had graduated perhaps a year before me. And what had happened in the UK is a new specification had been released to be taught across all schools. And it was a specification on religious studies, which is very much moral philosophy and philosophy of religion in the UK. So we thought, there's a gap in the market for a podcast which the thought goes into the structure. It has that engaging, more light-hearted aspect to it, something that you'd want to go and listen to rather than just a lecture or those. There's a lot of dry philosophy out there, as you found yourself by doing all of this, and we just wanted to add. We thought adding a bit of personality to it. So the podcast is, I suppose, the best way to describe it, and how we describe it now is offering accessible and engaging guides to the big questions and the big thinkers working on them. So it started off trying to support students and teachers of that new qualification in the UK, but we thought the topics would be interest to the public more generally. And as we found, as we moved towards the end of covering that specification, more and more members of the public were interested, and there were lots of topics they wanted us to cover. And so we haven't stopped really, and hopefully we're offering that expertise, for lack of a better term, might be a little bit more self-congratulatory, but Andrew and Ollie are certainly very, very good teachers. So what they do is they bring their pedagogical knowledge into public philosophy and make it engaging and accessible. And thanks to their hard work, that the podcast continues to bring that content.
Yes, I also wanted to ask you a little bit more about that last point, because I'm also a podcaster. I don't have formal training in philosophy, for example. I have a background in science. But is it hard for you, or do you find it hard sometimes to communicate, particularly when we're talking about complex ideas in philosophy, to lay people, or make them accessible to lay people? Because that's something when it comes to areas, I'm more familiar with the jargon and with the technical terms and with the basics of them, at least, that sometimes I find it a little bit hard to expose information in a way that is appealing for a more general public. Do you also struggle with that or not?
That's a really interesting question. I think personally, I don't find myself struggling with it too much these days because I'm very much used to teaching like undergraduates or high school students, and having done the podcast for such a long time, the goal is always my job is just to read the content and teach it to students or the general public in those ways. So that's my only goal, really. I think what you're doing in particular, and why it might be hard from an interviewer's perspective, and we find this on the podcast, is sometimes you've got a guest who wants to make sure their ideas are articulated in such a way that if they were scrutinized by another academic or in the form of an academic paper, they would stand up to those criticisms. So we've had interviews, perhaps some good examples in philosophy of mind, like our interview with Hada Hessel-Merck on integrated information theory. That's a complex and difficult idea, and she wanted to convey those in the way that she's used to. So that can be tricky for some of our audience members, and sometimes they are on that end of the differentiation spectrum that you have to have some kind of background. So we say, go back and listen to these episodes so you're ready for it. Or that interview with Michelle Montagu, which is in the book as well, in Philosophers on Consciousness, we spent a long time trying to make sure that content was going to be accessible. So I remember basically a full day of me, Greg Miller, and Ollie just sat around like, how can we even get these ideas, like communicate them to each other, let alone speak to her and make sure the audience are there. But with a lot of time and energy and a lot of planning, we managed to, I think, make those ideas accessible. So I think, yes, it's not too much of a challenge these days. The biggest challenge is trying to make sure your guest does that, and that you don't spend the whole interview saying, oh, could you explain that concept again? You don't want it to be a list of definitions. Rather than saying parsimonious, just say simple, right? And keep it as parsimonious as you can.
Very well. So getting into the topic of this first book, that I guess it will be a series, correct? There is also some other books planned, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the goal is to do 10 to start with. Now, the next one's Philosophers on God, talking about existence. And the one after that will be Philosophers on Living Well, talking about morality. So we're coming towards the end of putting together book number 2, so that should be out towards the end of this year, 2022, or perhaps at the start of 23.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so consciousness. How would you define it?
How would you define consciousness? Well, the obvious definition, the most widely cited definition amongst philosophers, is Nagel's definition of there's something it's like to be that creature. If there's something it's like to be you, then, or be something in the world, be an agent, then you're conscious. So it's standard examples. It's the smell of coffee. It's the seeing of the color red. It's the headache after you've had too many drinks the night before and you wake up in the morning. Those things are consciousness. They're experiences. So consciousness is experience. I think when I explain that to people in day-to-day life, it doesn't help them anymore with a definition of consciousness, or it's what it's like to be you. That's already such a loaded idea and a loaded phrase, and I think sometimes we fail to appreciate that if you haven't done and covered the topic before, then you're not going to know what that means, what it's like to be you. So lately, just using a basic example that most people can engage with, take your phone, like your iPhone, for example, your smartphone. When you speak into the microphone of your smartphone, when you dance in front of your selfie camera, whatever the one on the front is, when you tap the screen, there's not something it's like to be that phone. All of that processing goes on in the dark on your phone's wires and bits and bobs. Sorry, I'm not a computer scientist. But when you speak into my microphone, when you dance in front of my cameras, and when you tap me, there's something it's like to be me. So consciousness is that thing which is within myself, but not within the computer. And that perhaps that's the best way to introduce all that thing is consciousness.
Well, but are you really sure about that? Because there are people who are panpsychists, so possibly even there's even something that it's like to be my computer, for example.
Yeah, I'm quite happy with that, and I'm agnostic on the point as to whether or not there is something it's like to be a computer. But for the starting off the discussion of consciousness, if we're asking what it is, I think that gives the everyday person a clear and a useful example.
Mm-hmm. And why would you say consciousness matters so much, or why should it matter from a philosophical perspective? Because I would guess that, I mean, in our daily lives, I would imagine people don't bother too much to think about what is consciousness, why they are conscious. I mean, it's just something that comes to us naturally, intuitively. I mean, we're just conscious and that's it, I guess. But and I'm not even asking what are possibly the functions of consciousness from a psychological or an evolutionary perspective. What roles does it serve? But why should it matter so much for philosophers to think about consciousness?
Good. So essentially the question is, who cares, right? And I hear this a lot when we're talking about consciousness or philosophy of mind or metaphysics more generally. And obviously you can ask that question of anything, right? Who cares? And I've worked with a lot of students, and believe me, even the things which are painfully obvious that they matter, you still get the question, who cares? So the answer to who cares is going to have to stop somewhere, or why care, that's going to have to stop somewhere. And so you might get off on the first stop when someone says, oh, well, it matters for the sake of itself. So why should you care about it? Well, I care whether there was ever life on Mars, right? And you might be skeptical as to whether that's got any interesting implications. If there was life on Mars, those intelligent creatures are already dead. We're never going to meet them. We can't learn from them. Who cares? But if it came out on the news tomorrow, the story about there was life on Mars, you might read through the article. You might think it's valuable just to learn about it for the sake of itself. So I'm often citing reasons which are existential or moral, and those ones seem to matter to people more and tap into their intuitions of what should matter more. But yeah, I don't have any issue with someone getting off on that first stop and saying, yeah, it just matters for the sake of itself. But it's one I've been trying to think about a little bit more recently, and not to much success, but simply because lots of people keep asking, is the question of self, right? It seems that consciousness matters because it's intimately tied up with the idea of who it is to be me, or what it is to have a self. So have you got any like Freaky Friday 17 again with what's the guy, Matthew Perry? Have you got a favorite Freaky Friday type film, Ricardo?
No, not really.
Have you seen either of them? Have you seen Freaky Friday or 17 again?
No. I don't think so. At least I can't recall. So.
Do you know the basic premise of a Freaky Friday film?
No, please tell me about it.
I think the genre of Freaky Friday maybe starts with John Locke, or probably a philosopher who comes up with it beforehand. So what happens in 17 again? Maybe Matthew Perry says like, oh, I wish I was 17 again. I can't remember the plot of the movie. Anyway, they trade bodies. Right? They wake up one day and let's say you're in my brain, Ricardo, and I'm in yours. And it seems like Ricardo is here and Jack is over there. So what is it that makes me there and you here? Everything else is the same, but our consciousness, our stream of consciousness has went into the other being. So for a lot of people, they think consciousness is intimately tied up with the idea of self. And so why does consciousness matter? Well, because cells matter for all kinds of reasons, including moral and existential ones. Does that answer your question? Is that enough there? Do you think it matters?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I think it matters. If we're going to talk about the self, then we would get into probably 3-hour conversation about what is the self, and even and that's also true for consciousness. But even if it's only an illusion, or if there's something more to it, or if it's just even a narrative, right, that we create for ourselves, and that might be functional in some way, but still an illusion. But since that is not one of the topics that we want to get into today because of time limitations, what are some of the main philosophical approaches to consciousness out there?
Yes, so in the book, we generally approach it in, broadly speaking, there are three major approaches. Like most people, you could be a dualist. So almost 90% of the world's population have some form of religious belief, which usually includes a view of having a soul. So you might think, I am my body and my soul, and my consciousness is synonymous with soul, or at least a feature of my soul is my stream of consciousness. You could be a physicalist. So a physicalist would say there are only physical properties and laws in the world. So all the things described by contemporary or future physics could be included in that. And then, as you suggested a moment ago, we've got a third view which attempts to bring in the virtues and avoid the vices of those two first views, called Panpsychism, which would say that consciousness is everywhere. Consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the cosmos. So those are three views that are explored in the book. The problems and things we like about them in each case.
Mm-hmm. What do you think would happen if we were stripped of consciousness as human beings? Because, of course, there's that famous Nagel paper about what it would be like to be a bat, right? And we could discuss here if other animals, other organisms that might also have some level of consciousness. I mean, there's also that discussion if we differ in terms of consciousness from other animals in kind or degree or both. I mean, what do you think would happen for us as humans, as we live our normal lives, if suddenly we didn't have consciousness?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is I think that, as I mentioned a moment ago, in the idea of self, we don't want to talk about it, but perhaps our lives, in any meaningful sense of the term, would disappear. There would be no experiences of the things that we love. There'd be no taste or anything. There wouldn't be an inner world going on of experiences. We've just got physical mechanisms, for a lack of a better phrase, bumping and going into each other and playing out in the world. So it'd be like a metaphysical wasteland type of a place where there are no lives, there's no meaning, there's no ethical subjects, there's nothing that really matters going on there. There's no world to appreciate and experience. So as soon as consciousness is gone, you don't have those. You asked what would happen to our lives. Our lives would sort of disappear. Yeah, it's pretty miserable. Ricardo, we're on quite a sad and dark and worrying place you've taken us to.
So earlier you said that one of the things that you try to connect consciousness to make the discussion or the problem more appealing to a general audience is ethics and the ethical implications of having or not having consciousness. So what is the relationship there? I mean, do we really need to be conscious for us to be ethical at the same time or not?
Yeah, I think so. It's not too much of a controversial view. I think it's the intuitive view that most people hold, but it's obviously not without its problems. But yeah, I think to be an ethical subject, to matter morally, is to have some kind of conscious experiences. That seems to me the most fundamental thing. Like I said a moment ago, if in this world where there is no consciousness, there are no ethical subjects. There's no one to experience pain, suffering, happiness, pleasure. Those things just aren't available to us without consciousness. Now, I'm sort of agnostic as to whether you have to have some contents to that consciousness in terms of happiness, pleasure, pain, and suffering. So in the book, as you know, David Chalmers uses that example of the Vulcan trolley problem. So to do the regular trolley problem first, you could say that you've got one human being on one track, normal, conscious human being, and you've got 5 zombies like me, but they don't have no inner worlds, no conscious experiences. Everything's in the dark for them. Well, choosing between letting the train roll over me or the 5 zombies, the obvious thing is to kill the 5 zombies. And then David Chalmers says, well, what if we said those 5 zombies weren't zombies but Vulcans, i.e. conscious creatures, but they don't have any evaluative concepts like pain, pleasure, happiness, suffering. They don't have any contents in that sense. They just have neutral states. Like think of 1 + 1 = 2. Think of a triangle. Like there's no happiness or pleasure or pain or suffering associated with those thoughts. So it's like an extreme version of Spock from Star Trek. And he says it would be morally abhorrent to kill those 5 Vulcans just to save that one ordinary Conchi, that ordinary human being who can experience those states. And I'm not sure there. I'm thinking about it a little bit, and I think I have no idea what I do or what I should do in that scenario. But what I do know is that consciousness is what gives the value on the fundamental level. That, as I mentioned a moment ago, in that world without any conscious creatures, that a world with consciousness is more valuable than one without consciousness. So, in a word then, Ricardo, I'd say, yes, you need consciousness to be an ethical subject, but the question is what kind of contents of consciousness do you need to be an ethical subject? Is conscious alone sufficient? Maybe.
Yes, because in terms of the content, I mean, we could be talking about consciousness in terms of emotions, right? Like, for example, pleasure, pain, and possibly some theory of mind going around there where we can also attribute the same mental states to other, at least conspecifics, I guess, if we're talking about beings from the same species. But I mean, perhaps, do you think that in order for us to be ethical subjects, we also need to be able to articulate ethical principles, and so we also need to have conscious access to ethical beliefs, moral principles, and things of that sort.
So is the question, do you think I need to be able to articulate or comprehend moral principles in order to be an ethical subject?
Yes, or simply be oriented by emotions, for example.
So I don't think you need to be able to articulate them or have those concepts. And I'm not sure what kind of role the emotions are going to play, but maybe I'll figure it out if I say it out loud. That clearly non-human animals are ethical subjects. That seems obviously true to me. They can't articulate their moral framework. They don't hold the concepts of good, bad, evil. No. But they do seem capable, first of all, of being ethical subjects that should come into our consideration. So causing suffering or gratuitous suffering to a non-human animal seems obviously wrong. But you might also think that for a creature who's going about their way in the world to sacrifice, like say you were I'm trying to think of an animal that would do something like this. I'll just pick a random one. Say I was a rabbit and had a little rabbit offspring. What's a baby rabbit called? Is there a name for a baby rabbit?
I'm not sure.
Say I was a big rabbit, and I'm googling baby rabbit name as I'm stalling here at the same time. A kitten? A baby rabbit's called a kitten? Wow.
Oh, also a
Okay,
kitten. Okay.
cool. So say I'm a rabbit and say I have some kittens and there's a fox that comes to kill my kittens. If I sacrifice myself to save my kittens, that's a good thing, right? The rabbit has done a good. There must be something good in and of itself about sacrificing yourself for other creatures, regardless of whether or not you're free or conscious or were devising some moral system. There has to be something good about that act. Otherwise, when you freely choose to do that act, it wouldn't be a good act if there was no goodness at the end of it. So perhaps it's not good on the same level as a normal human being who would comprehend moral theory and has free will, but there is goodness still in the sacrificing of the rabbit for its kittens. So no, I think you can be an ethical subject simply by having conscious experiences, i.e. those matter and should come into our equations when we're making decisions, but also you can do good and bad acts regardless of whether or not you are conscious.
Mm-hmm. I was also thinking about the sort of elephant and the rider metaphor used by people like Jonathan Haidt, who study moral foundations. And I mean, the idea that many times what people articulate in terms of their moral principles, for example, does not correspond exactly and sometimes not at all with how they behave or they give justifications after the fact. That is, they come up with some sort of post hoc rationalization. So I was just trying to understand what would exactly be, I mean, trying to nail down what aspects of consciousness or what would need to be conscious in us for us to be ethical subjects, because we don't seem to have psychologically access to most of what happens in our minds, even in terms of motivations and what influences our behavior in one direction or the other, for example.
Okay, great. So I think there's at least two things going on in that question, or at least in what you've explained there. The first thing is what it is to be an ethical subject, as in what types of things should come into our moral calculations. And as I said a moment ago, and let's just take the hedonistic utilitarian's view that says what matters is pain, pleasure, happiness, suffering. Those are the things that should be reduced, i.e. pain and suffering, and we should cultivate and increase the amount of happiness and pleasure in the world. So when you say, what is it for us to be ethical subjects? Well, as long as you're capable of having those experiences of happiness, pleasure, pain, and suffering, then you should come into a calculation. But then there's the second question, is which you're asking there, is what is it to make a moral decision? Can they be made subconsciously, for lack of a better term, unconsciously? Do I make up the reasons why I've acted after the fact? Do those count as moral decisions, etc.? If the rabbit saves its kittens, is it making a moral decision there? Why does it seem like I am? Why did you stop me from getting hit by that car? Well, maybe I just acted impulsively. Maybe I didn't do a calculation. I'll give you one afterwards. I suppose the philosophy of decision making might get a little bit too complex and above my pay grade here. So I see that as a separate question to what it is to be an ethical subject. Your question is, what is it to make decisions? What's sufficient for saying that I decided to do that? And I'm not sure I have an answer which is not going to be too off the cuff for you there, Ricardo.
Fair enough. I was just trying to understand also, even from an evolutionary perspective, what would consciousness be good for, if anything? Because, I mean, at least I myself, possibly you as a philosopher who thought more about this than I did would think otherwise, but I myself can very easily imagine just a being doing some subconscious or unconscious computations and having the same output in terms of behavior that we would call ethical or moral. I mean, when it comes to interacting with other beings, again, without having to have conscious access to virtually anything, as long as the brain would process the information and give a certain output.
So Susan Blackmore's got a nice way in here, and it's the same example used by David Chalmers in his book The Conscious Mind. And they both ask us to imagine two creatures in our evolutionary past. One, conscious, human beings just like you and me, and zombies exactly the same as us, but they lack consciousness. And Susan Blackmore says, well, it doesn't look like evolution would have any reason to favor the conscious over the zombie. They're behaviorally indistinguishable from us. So what would be the benefit in being conscious?
Yeah.
Now, Dave Chalmers agrees and says, well, evolution's not going to do all the work for you. Maybe it collapses wave functions or something like that. The world is disordered in some fundamental way, and consciousness brings order to it for a quick explanation of the view. Then I don't know too much about that view, but I still want to find some kind of more obviously true evolutionary reason for it. People like Pat Churchland, as you know, will say it allows you to use language. People think that it allows you to introspect. Perhaps the view I'm most sympathetic to would be the view that consciousness, and this is a view associated with Massimo Pigliucci, who uses it in the book, consciousness allows you to simulate possible scenarios. So I think about what I might do tomorrow. I can imagine all the things that I'm going to go about and do. And by able to simulate those scenarios, I can run the risk, do the calculations, and a creature that could do that in the sanctuary of their own mind would be more likely to survive than one who just went about the world and figured things out behavioristically, just through trial and error and never being able to figure it out for themselves. But I'm not sure. I mean, there's that great example, isn't there, of let's take I forget whose example it is, but say a woman was there as they're coming towards the end of their cycle and they're about to have a period, and you have an increase of progesterone as you're about to during your ovulation, and so that hormone tightens up your pores and gives rise to spots, and so one might ask, oh, why do women typically wear more makeup when they're ovulating? And you might think, oh well, to look better, to increase the chances of reproduction from an evolutionary perspective. But it's much more fundamental than that. It's just that you're getting spots. So it's hard. You want to make sure you're not confusing correlation with cause in that example. And the same with running simulations. Like, yes, I can run simulations, but is that the reason why? Or rather, I can simulate possible outcomes, but is that the reason why consciousness came about in the first place? Would it be that influential on my survival? Because I can imagine lots of non-human animals who don't have the power to simulate possible outcomes. I can imagine some more primitive kinds of consciousness or brain powers that they just experience the world, and they can't sit there and contemplate all the things that could happen in the future. Yeah, it seems to me at least that those creatures are conscious. So perhaps that candidate's not as good as one than I first thought. But yeah, I like most of the stuff in the book, Ricardo. I'm agnostic as to whether or not it could have a function. But at least I think Susan Blackmore's and David Chalmers' example and the thought experiment does show is that it's not as clear and as straightforward as we might think, or as the general public might think. And it also leads into something perhaps you want to talk about a little bit later on, the Panpsychist front. Well, evolution needs some kind of fundamental building blocks to play with, so more complex things can develop. So obviously, we need some physical stuff for evolution to give me eyes and ears and thumbs. Like, it didn't just come from nowhere. I need some fundamental physical properties in the world. And you might think the same for consciousness, that you need some kind of rudimentary consciousness and fundamental consciousness there to begin with in order to get these more interesting, complex forms of consciousness that allow you to run these simulations of things that can happen in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just asking questions here. Some of them might even be silly. I don't know. As I said, I have mostly a scientific background, and I'm always trying to understand where things come from, an evolutionary perspective mostly. And one of the things you mentioned there reminds me of I hope I'm not mistaken on the term, but it's something like the imaginative worlds hypothesis put forth by Edward O. Wilson, who died recently, one of the biggest evolutionary biologists of the last century, where he mentioned the hypothesis that consciousness would serve the function of us being able to imagine different possible scenarios without us having to directly experience them and put ourselves at unnecessary risk and simulate what would happen in different kinds of situations, for example.
But do you think a rabbit could run those scenarios in the head, Ricardo, about the likelihood of keeping their kittens safe?
Well, I don't know.
I assume that you think that a rabbit is conscious, right? Do you think a rabbit can experience pain, pleasure, and?
Well, when it comes to the consciousness of other animals, I guess I would tend to rely also from perhaps a vegan perspective, coming from people like Peter Singer and others, right? I think I would tend to rely more on the neural correlates of consciousness that is trying to find the same brain structures and the same patterns of activation in other animals as we do in humans, in this case, for consciousness.
Can I push on it just out of interest, not because I'm trying to play Socrates
no,
and
of
trip
course,
you up
of
on
course.
anything? I'm genuinely interested because I've only been thinking about this for a couple of days and not in any significant depth. First of all, do you think that a rabbit or a kitten's conscious?
I do believe that they are. I mean, I think that there's good evidence that at least they have a somewhat complex emotional life, and that probably also manifests consciously.
Yeah. Okay. I think most people would, right? If I came over to yours and I kicked your rabbit, right? You'd be like, "Hell, do you think you're doing? That? Kick my rabbit." And if I said, "Oh, it's no different to me kicking your computer," you'd think I was crazy. Not just because it's alive, but because it presumably can feel that kick. But do you think a rabbit can simulate possible scenarios? Do you think a rabbit can think about, maybe I can sneak into the farmer's yard, maybe not hold the concept of farmers and yard and lettuce, but do you think they can simulate, like, oh, this is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to run over there and I'm going to eat the lettuce and I'm going to, I don't know what rabbits get up to. I really shouldn't have used a rabbit as my example, but do you think it can run those scenarios?
Well, I'm not sure at all. Perhaps one example that is easier for me to understand would be the example of a lion trying to plan catching a prey, for example. It seems more... I'm not sure about rabbits because I don't know much about them, but it's very easy for me to imagine that when a lion is heading toward a prey in disguise or something like that, he or she is doing some sort of planning ahead the movements that he or she will do to catch the prey. So, I mean, I think that's plausible. So,
yeah, cool. I'll think some more about it. Thank you for that. Maybe I'll start thinking about animals that I know more about rather than just rabbits and kittens.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes some of these can also get a little bit anthropocentric, right? Because we might get ourselves interpreting the behaviors of other animals, comparing them to our own behaviors, and then attributing similar mental states to
Yeah.
them, and that might not be the case. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure about this one because you hear this a lot, don't you? That perspectives and approaches to understanding consciousness get accused of being anthropocentric, i.e., putting the human condition first and forming our understanding of the world around it. But basically, I think maybe a poor definition of it would be to say that they place humans as the most important things in the world. But certainly, what people are being accused of is saying, well, this is what it is to be human, so that applies to other things too. That seems more anthropomorphism than it does anthropocentrism.
Oh, right, exactly. No, sorry, I used the wrong term. I meant anthropomorphic instead of anthropocentric. Yeah, sorry.
Right. Yeah, I think. Well, with like we did with the rabbit, though, right? If I doubt very few people are attributing all the mental states that human beings can have to all non-human animals as if it was a kind of Disney movie. So maybe that's a little bit of a straw man. But with the right caution, we can say that they're conscious, that there's something it's like to be them. And we assume that they have those states when we train a horse or when we feed and look after our dog, take it for a walk, and we see the types of reactions they have to stuff. Like when a dog loses like another dog in its pack, like and it seems to grieve or be upset or feel the loss and look for them. I don't think you're doing anything like metaphysically in bad faith or you're making a ridiculous inference to be like, yeah, the dog's it misses them, like it's experiencing loss, like that's a really, like I'm an animal too. Like I get that, and I think that's fine. But yeah, I don't think there's the risk of philosophers of mind anthropomorphizing too much. If in fact they often go the complete opposite way.
Yeah. So moving on to another topic on consciousness, and this is one perhaps that is very contentious. All topics in consciousness are contentious, I guess, but what about the hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers named it? What is it about, and I mean, what's the issue there?
Yeah, okay, good. So in a word, 2 words, the problem is explain consciousness. And then to develop it a bit more, the hard problem of consciousness asks, how and why is there something it's like to be a creature or a being, an agent? So if it's just physical stuff out there in the world, then why is there this qualitative aspect? Why doesn't all my brain process and just go on in the dark? So to draw that example from earlier when we spoke about conscious and zombies, why aren't we just zombies? We're clearly not just zombies. So how is it that consciousness comes about from this seemingly physical world?
Right. So it's the problem. Isn't it connected in some way to the issue of I mean, I can't remember exactly the name now, but there's that thought experiment of someone learning everything there is to know about the color red,
Yeah.
then getting out of the room and experiencing red, and so there's supposedly there's some sort of epistemic value that is added to the experiencing of the color red that he wouldn't get just by knowing all of the neuroscience of the color red, for example, right?
Yeah. So there are a few ways of motivating the problem, and Frank Jackson's knowledge arguments are widely cited and a good one. And in the book, he gives an original essay explaining why he changed his mind on the thought experiment which is hugely popular. But there's a couple of ways in. You might say, well, let's assume physicalism is true for a moment. Mm-hmm. So let's just say everything described by physics is all there is. Well, if you recreated every part of me physically, would my consciousness necessarily follow? And if it does necessarily follow, then what is it about my physical processes that allow it to follow? So that's one way of putting it. But it doesn't seem obvious to a lot of philosophers that it would follow, that this seeming that feeling of that non-physical aspect, or that feeling of there's some that qualitative rather than the quantitative aspect of me doesn't follow when you recreate me physically. And Jackson's one says, well, imagine this neuroscientist, this brilliant neuroscientist, Mary, who spends her entire life in this black and white room learning every physical fact there is to know about seeing the color red. When she leaves the room, she sees a red rose for the first time. Would she be able to recognize that red rose? Would she know a fact about what it's like to experience the world from the physical facts alone? Does she learn something new? Does she learn a non-physical fact, the qualia or qualia of seeing red? And in the book, Jackson says, well, no, she wouldn't, but there's a reason why she wouldn't. So he says that there are some experiences that we have that are transparent. So I look at a square out there in the world, like I don't know what square shape. My examples are dreadful today. Let's take the book in front of me. Let's do some marketing. Let's take a rectangle here, right? And I can see my experience is transparent because I can see that it's got four corners and four sides and that it's square shaped. So my experience reveals the nature of that thing. But there are some things which aren't transparent to us and that we need to learn a little bit more about them before we can know the nature of them. So I could learn everything there is to know about squares in the black and white room. And when I left, and maybe I'd never seen a square, and I learned every physical fact there are about squares. Show me a square, I'd be like, yeah, it's a square. I can recognize that fits the criteria of squareness that I learned about in the room. But the difficulty with experiencing color, or color vision, or colors more generally, is that they're not transparent in the same way, says Jackson. So it's hard to see where they are on the color solid spectrum. So those like saturation and the hue, like the intensity of the color, type of color it is, how light or dark it is. I can't map it on that spectrum simply through my experience alone. So I'll need the tools of science to help me identify where it would fit on there. I need some instruments to determine what it's going to be like. So she won't recognize them because my experience of color doesn't tell me every physical fact there is to know about it in that same way. So maybe I'm going a little bit too far afield there. The main point is this, that you could know every physical fact there is to know about the world, but you still wouldn't know what it's like to see red, and there's a non-physical fact there if the physical facts don't cover all of the facts.
Mm-hmm. And what is illusionism? And if consciousness is an illusion, is it the same as not existing? And what would that mean even?
Cool. So Keith Frankish gives a nice example in the book to explain illusionism and what the view entails. He gives a great thought experiment of walking down the street and you see this woman with a box, seemingly a street magician of some kind. She gets you to look into the box and there's nothing there. Then she says some mumbo jumbo and she opens the box and you see a little beetle inside. Now, she closes the box again. Maybe she shows you there's no beetle there after all. So you've got three explanations you might give for the beetle being in the box. You might think that it's just it is magic. You might think, I was going to say just magic. You might think it's just magic. You might think that it's actually magic and something that she's got some kind of special powers and the supernatural's involved, or some non-physical force is working in the world. And that might not be your go-to. It seems like you're adding too much to your theory there. I don't think anyone would be reasonable in thinking that in the context of the thought experiment. You might think that you can be explained by physics alone, by ordinary, everyday scientific explanation. Or you might think that it was an illusion that the beetle was there. It seems to you like the beetle's there, but it's not really there. And you experience those sort of things when you've probably seen on like social media or in popular psychology books or psychology books more generally. You have these optical illusions, don't you, where it's not really the case that the street is moving when you look at it on the picture, or that the colors are there on the screen. It's an illusion of your experience. It's a physical trick of the brain. So the illusionist says something similar about consciousness. You think the beetle's there, and you asked a moment ago, does that mean it's not real? No, you see the beetle. Like the beetle is there, and the beetle exists, but the beetle's not what you think it is. The beetle's an illusion, a trick of your brain, and not actually something that's there in the world. So that's how a small minority of philosophers of mind, like Daniel Dennett and Keith Frankish, would attempt to solve the hard problem of consciousness. They're trying to solve the meta problem of consciousness, which asks, why do we say and think all of the things that we do about consciousness? And if you can explain why we think we're conscious, if you can give an account of what gives rise to the illusion and why we think there's the beetle's there in the first place, then the hard problem will disappear. You can say, oh, well, here's how the illusion comes about. Here's the nature of illusionism, and hopefully the hard problem will dissolve, they say. Well, they say it will dissolve.
Mm-hmm. But, I mean, then why would we have that kind of illusion? Do they have anything to say about that?
Presumably, off the top of my head, it's just going to be the same reasons that anybody else gives for how. Oh, so is the question here, why would we develop the capacity to have illusion of consciousness? Like, why would? Yeah, I assume it's going to be this. It's going to be the same sort of thing as the panpsychists or other kinds of physicists. They've all got to explain what its role is. They're just saying that. So think of, in the context of those positions we described earlier, the dualist gives us two kinds of properties or substances. Mm-hmm. We don't want that from our ontology or from our fundamental theory of the world. We want to assume or postulate the least number of substances, types of substances, and properties of some substances as possible, and we should prefer the simpler view. So the physicalist attempts to do that by saying, well, there's just physical stuff, and consciousness is just an illusion in that way. And so they're all going to have to explain why would we develop the capacity. They still think that consciousness seems as it does to you, me, the dualist, the panpsychist. They all say consciousness seems to us in that same way. They just say, well, its fundamental structure and properties and nature is just something other than what we thought it was. Like, we thought sunsets functioned in a certain way, the sun was actually setting, but we still look at them, we still see them, we still think it's the same thing. You can still ask yourself, well, why does the sun set? But it's just not the same kind of setting as you thought in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to panpsychism specifically, how would you explain it? I mean, is it really, because when we get, for example, in your book into the chapter about the interview with Patricia Churchland, I mean, she makes some very funny, she has some very funny ways of putting her position on panpsychism, and so she doesn't seem to take it very seriously. But do you think what would be the way of still manning, let's say, panpsychism?
Well, maybe a nice way in is to use the example of Pat Churchland of Dan Dennett. So the first parody or sarcastic interpretation of panpsychism is given by Pat Churchland in the book, and she says, well, panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is everywhere, is no more reasonable than my view, which is pancrapism, and the whole universe is crap. And she says neither of them do any work, neither of them are equally untestable, etc., etc. And Dan Dennett uses a little less on the nose example, and he says, well, I've got this other view called pan-niftyism, that everything's nifty. What follows from pan-niftyism? Nothing. same happens with panpsychism. I think the panpsychist would say there's not a problem with how niftiness and crap fits into our picture of the world. Like, the former is a psychological process grounded in physical processes in the brain, and the other one is maybe niftiness, isn't it? Maybe there's more to niftiness. Let's not talk about the nature of niftiness. Like, crap is just physical properties, right? It's just, and we all know what it is. We're all we're all familiar with it in some way, and it doesn't need explaining. There isn't a philosophy of crap. There's no need to have one. But what there is a problem with is how we fit the seemingly non-physical thing into our picture of reality, i.e., consciousness. How do we get the mind in the context of the world? So, the panpsychist essentially says something like this: physics is silent on the intrinsic nature of matter, i.e., what is the essence of the world. Physics explains things in terms of what things do, in terms of their dispositions, in terms of cause and effect, but what is the intrinsic nature of it? What is it on a fundamental level? And they say, look, we've got this hole in our picture of reality and what the nature of the world is, and we've got this property consciousness which we need to fit in somewhere. And so they say the intrinsic nature of stuff is consciousness. And so, I mean, you don't, as again in the context of niftyism and crap, that you don't need, there's no problem with how they fit into our scientific picture of reality, but there is a problem with how consciousness fits in with our theory of reality in terms of physical science.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, or are there any non-naturalist approaches to consciousness that in the sort of more scientifically minded or scientifically driven world we live nowadays would still make sense? Like, for example, something coming from theology.
Are you asking, are there any like supernatural versions of metaphysics?
Supernatural versions of explaining where consciousness comes from. That you think would still be relevant to consider nowadays.
Yeah. Okay. So there's obviously a fair few. Well, first of all, the question of what naturalism is. Typically, we mean there's just physical things in the world, and there's just physical laws, properties. Again, it's no supernatural things like ghosts and gods and angels.
Yeah.
So that would be a ready-to-go definition of naturalism. But a lot of people would dispute that conception of naturalism and say, why should we assume that nature or the natural world is void of consciousness, is void of things that seemingly aren't purely the things described by physics? So Strawson calls them naturalists and says, oh, well, the naturalists assume that matter isn't conscious, and then they say the brain is this purely physical, natural thing, and then they wonder how consciousness comes into the picture. Well, I think it's begging the question, he says, to think that, to begin with, consciousness isn't a part of the reasonable naturalist theory. And so, yeah, but let's take the first definition. Let's just say it's just physical stuff. And a supernaturalist view technically would be a form of substance dualism, and there are obviously plenty of philosophers in the philosophy of religion who embrace a form of Abrahamic faith, such as Christianity, who would say that we can't explain it in terms of our scientific models. These other views are problematic. Good old dualist or property dualism is the way to go about it. I think that, on lots of people's views, would be a type of supernaturalism. But more kooky, more progressive, maybe, views, more innovative views of supernaturalist metaphysics that might help us solve the problem of consciousness. There's lots of work going on in alternative concepts of God and pantheistic views that would say, you might be a cosmopsychist that says the whole universe is this one big conscious mind, and then it breaks into individual perspectives. So this big conscious mind is perspectiveless, and individual perspectives arise within it. I mean, that's, might think that's, it can embrace a form of Hinduism, you think of the people who have these religious experiences and see the true nature of reality, or Schopenhauer's view that it's just an illusion, that there is a you and a me, there's no idea of self, it's just the will, and that's the world, and that will is this big conscious mind. And yeah, I think those are like they're cooked up in the metaphysician's laboratory, and you'll get some funny looks if you're at the pub and you say that you embrace one of these views, particularly in the West. But yeah, they offer you elegant and persuasive theories of how consciousness can fit into our universe. But that saying there's no physical world for the idealist panpsychist, or saying that God is the universe is God, and we exist in this big conscious mind, might be too much for people like Pat Churchland, who want to explain just this particular kind of brain function. So yeah, promising views, and views that we should take seriously if you take the hard problem seriously.
Mm-hmm. And what about you personally? Because of course you've interviewed these people and edited the book, but do you have any personal take on what would be the most promising approach to consciousness from a philosophical perspective among all of these ones that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so in the book, I give perhaps the illusion to the reader that I would adopt a form of idealist panpsychism along with Miri al-Bahari in the final chapter, which she invites me to co-author with her. So I give the impression that we've been on this journey through, here's the nature of consciousness, here's the hard problem, here are some people who are trying to deflate the problem, say it's not that hard, here are the illusionists and the panpsychists, and we end on this idealist panpsychism that says there is no physical stuff, it's all just mind stuff, it's all just ideas and consciousness and individual minds within that. But I'm not married to the idea, and I wouldn't describe myself as a panpsychist when I'm going about my day-to-day life. So I'd say I'm agnostic on as to what the best approach is. I suppose there are lots of people who are much better suited to answer that question than me, and I'm simply presenting the ideas and the obvious problems and benefits of each of you and bringing them into tension with each other. And I think that's a good position for the public philosopher in general to be in, that they haven't got their agenda, and that they do embrace a level of impartiality. But with that said, there are obvious views, like if you push me, I'd say in my personal view that physics alone, physical science, is never going to be able to explain consciousness. I think that's obviously true, given the framework and methodology which set out by Galileo, as Goff discusses in the book. And I suppose I would say I was more aligned with a version of panpsychism, and I'm certainly more interested in the idea of panpsychism. And I think we had a conference here in Liverpool a few weeks ago, and someone said, "Why is everyone here obsessed with panpsychism?" And it's because it grabs people's imaginations and thoughts, and it's interesting. It's big ideas. It's a lot of what we get into philosophy in the first place to discuss. So, yeah, I'd say I was more happy with. I'm not quite as dogmatic as outright rejecting illusionism. I'm not a big fan of deflating the problem, and yeah. So, a long way about it. I'd say if it pushed me, I'd be towards a view of panpsychism.
Yeah. So just a couple of final questions, and since you teach and communicate philosophy or communicate about philosophy, we've been talking about consciousness here, but it could apply to any other sort of question in philosophy. Do you think that the goal of philosophy is really to arrive at a concrete and definitive answer to a particular question, or is it mostly to think about it, to come up with new questions, to think about what might be the most relevant ways of approaching the questions and so on? I mean, is it more about really knowing the answer or asking the questions?
Good. A good combination of both of them, I suppose. I think the philosopher can say stuff like, there are no square circles. There are no square circles in a possible world, and that it breaches the law of non-contradiction. I think that's a definitive truth that philosophy can offer. Might not be the most exciting thing that philosophy can teach you and me, but that's an example of it giving us a truth. It can give us highly probable theories, the most plausible theories of consciousness and of questions of morality and so on and so forth, and gets us over that 50% mark, and it becomes a reasonable thing to believe in. And philosophy can certainly give us those things and open those new and interesting questions. But I think as well, I embrace an understanding of philosophy that Massimo Pigliucci offers in the book as to science being a branch of philosophy, a hyper-specialized and in so far distinct and evolved version of philosophy that it would be weird almost to use the same name to describe it. But it comes from the same, it has the same genealogy. It stems from philosophy, and ultimately it informs our wider philosophical view of the nature of reality, our big picture theory of how it all hangs together. So if you think that it's reasonable to believe in things like gravity and that water's H2O and that in another world water couldn't be anything other than H2O, then it seems like philosophy does give you those answers that we typically take to be definitive in put colloquially.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned science, that's precisely the last question I had for you. How do you look at the relationship between philosophy and science? And if we have a question that can be tackled both by philosophy and science, do you think that we should prioritize the answer science arrives at and provides us with? Or do you think that philosophy, even if the question can be answered by science, philosophy can still add something more to it?
Yeah, so I'll try and offer a different take than the one I've just given, which would be that ultimately it informs philosophy and they work hand in hand, and I don't think there's any huge tension there. I think if you're trying to use the wrong branch of philosophy, i.e. science, to explain what another branch of philosophy would be more suited towards, like first philosophy or metaphysics more generally, then that would be misplaced. So I think there are obviously areas in which philosophy is in a better place to answer those, and simply the methodology of science, physical science, isn't appropriate. We need to think that we need to be clear on what science involves, and that's explaining the physical universe at a particular point in time, and it does so in the context of what occurred at an earlier time and how the laws of nature operate in bringing about the perceived effects, and that's physical. So science isn't going to give you an explanation for like to take philosophy of religion, like pre-Big Bang, timeless, spaceless, physicalless reality, like how it has nothing to say on those questions, because science is its methodology is physical. And you might think the same sort of applies with consciousness here. If consciousness is not a physical thing, or it's the illusion of physicality, then it doesn't seem like it's if you thought it was non-physical, then physical science isn't going to give you the answer. And it's that simple. If it was physical, if it was an obviously physical thing, something publicly observable and something that can be explained in the language of science, then yeah, it would be best suited for it. But I don't think that's the case.
Mm-hmm. I also asked you that question because I've heard already some scientists mainly, but I could also name perhaps a couple of philosophers. The scientists, people like Richard Dawkins, for example, saying that for the most part, philosophy has become or is about to become obsolete due to the existence of science. So,
yeah, I mean, I think Richard's not saying anything which it sounds really controversial, doesn't it? It sounds like a big like controversial hot take that is almost divorced from the reality of the appropriate methodologies. But Richard's clearly quite happy with discussing philosophical concepts. He clearly thinks that like selecting between certain scientific theories is something that scientists should be doing. You might call that philosophy. He just calls that science. I don't think we should get overly protective about the name calling here. Like, he's not going to abandon the law of non-contradiction anytime soon, and so you shouldn't be too worried about his views on it. I'm not sure where Dawkins sits on the hard problem. We're having him on the show in a few weeks' time on the Panpsycast to talk about entitled "Why I'm an Atheist," essentially. And I know he's read through Philosophers on consciousness, and I assume he probably favours a view like Dennett's. He's got huge respect for Dennett's approach, and it would certainly align with his more general metaphysics of just embracing the physical and avoiding any kind of kooky supernatural things. But yeah, so in a word, I think Dawkins is probably happy with a lot more philosophy than we give him credit for. He just calls it science.
Okay, great. So apart from the book, for which I will be leaving a link in the description box of the interview, would you like to promote your work, tell people where they can find you, the Panpsycast Philosophy Podcast on the internet and other stuff like that?
Cool. Yeah, thank you. It's nice to have a little platform at the end for just shameless self-promotion, so I'll take you up on it. Yeah, so the Panpsycast Philosophy Podcast, so you just search Panpsycast, Panpsycast, for those guides to philosophical questions and interviews with people that, if you're interested in Ricardo's and the Dissenter's work, then yeah, we've had lots of similar guests, perhaps talking about different things and bringing them into tension with one of those. So if you like those interviews, check out the Panpsycast. The book series is obviously it's something worth checking out. If you enjoyed our discussion today on the nature of consciousness and some of those perspectives, then check out Philosophers on Consciousness. But thirdly, we're hosting a live show in Liverpool on May 20th on the mystery of consciousness. So there, Philip Goff, Anil Seth, Laura Gow, and Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop. So if you're interested in seeing these people actually debate each other directly, rather than being in individual interviews, but literally arguing with one another from these radically different perspectives and positions, then yeah, come to the live show in Liverpool on May 20th. Search for the Mystery of Consciousness Liverpool. And if you can't be there in person because you're nowhere near Liverpool or the UK, then there'll be video footage through Unbelievable's YouTube channel, which is the one hosted by Justin Brierley of Premier Radio. So yeah, just search for the Mystery of Consciousness Liverpool, Philosophers on Consciousness, or Panpsycast. Thank you, Ricardo. That was I appreciate the opportunity, and it's been really nice talking to you. I wish I asked you more questions about your views on these things. Haven't you spoken to probably the same amount of people as I have on the topic, but perhaps a conversation for another day.
Yeah, probably a conversation for when your next book in the series comes out. What about that?
Great, that sounds good. Yeah, let's hopefully it won't take another 2 or 3 years for us to get around to having the conversation, but it's been worth the wait, so thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
You're very welcome. Take care, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Calamba, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Belize, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.